Larry Kowalchuk is a Saskatchewan lawyer with a deep commitment to environmental and Aboriginal rights, which he argues are intimately connected. The resources that the fossil fuel economy requires are largely to be found in Canada and mostly in Aboriginal territory. Getting unfettered access to those resources requires the destruction of native title, native values, native cultures, in short, genocide. Conversely, if life on Earth is to have a future, and climate change driven by the fossil fuel economy threatens that future, then both the exploitation and the genocide must stop. For Kowalchuk, though, law is not a set of rules, but a place to hold a discourse on the kind of society we want to create. And that's what Larry Kowalchuk is all about. That's why a lawyer from the prairies finds himself representing two citizen groups in New Brunswick that have launched dramatic legal challenges against the New Brunswick and federal governments and the petroleum industry. The New Brunswick Anti-Shale Gas Alliance argues that the development of unconventional shale gas and oil deposits poses so great a threat to human health and the environment that it violates Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees the right to life and security of the person. The People's lawsuit argues that the two governments and their courts have attacked the rights of citizens and have granted illegal approval to the industry to develop shale gas, ignore environmental protection laws, and unlawfully use police and malicious lawsuits to suppress and silence protectors of civil and human rights. Both suits seek to halt such development until it can be shown to be safe, if indeed it ever can be.
When I went into private practice, I was in-house counsel for a union. It was almost the next day, if I can use the term, I don't know, more knocked on my door, or I ended up in that path and started working with people in northern Saskatchewan through a group called the Committee for Future Generations, who you should meet. It's a committee that is what we are now going to call CSIS, but it's a committee of people who are premised on the fact that we need to change the way we relate to our environment for present and future generations, and that's what they called themselves, the Committee for Future Generations. So it's, there were at that time people who identify as Métis, people who identify as First Nations, people who identify as Aboriginal, people who were cottage owners, settlers, environmentalists, and they all came together to work on one concept, and that is we're all treaty people, because they're in northern Saskatchewan it's treaties, but we're all treaty people. Our responsibility is mutual. We signed a deal or a contract, whatever you want to call it. Both sides have a responsibility to enforce it, and should. And so they went to try to stop uranium mining in court and collaboration agreements. So I got to meet people, and they met people here, and then I got a call. I suspect it's through Willie, and they asked me to come here, and I went to a gathering of people to talk about the concepts of stopping climate change or protecting the environment, and dealing with what I'll call genocide now, but the attempts to remove from our society the things that we need to learn from the original cultures, Aboriginal people. And so I met them all in a coffee shop, and things went from there.
Willie said that you had said to them, "I'm humbled to be able to work with them," and she said, "I never thought I'd ever hear that from a lawyer."
Oh, that's an understatement. Like we were talking earlier, I have the privilege of meeting people who every part of their life has been struggle for justice, concretely, in their words and their actions, more importantly. And their commitment to, you know, in some cultures it's called Mother Earth, in others it's called Gaia, in others it's just simply the land and the air and the water. And I'm constantly, I mean, it's not humbling in the sense of sort of me, them. It's just how incredible the learning curve I'm getting from meeting and talking to people, and to become part of something that really is quite beautiful to see. It's that's what it is. And well, she might not expect to hear it from a lawyer. There are lawyers and doctors and scientists and politicians and people. That's who we are, who are easily capable of appreciating moments of beauty when you see them.
I guess I want to take you back to that early meeting, and to so you find yourself here and you're meeting all these new people, and you're asked to be involved with several cases. Can you give me a sort of a thumbnail of what those cases are about?
Well, there's two. Because I'm from Saskatchewan, I don't have the right to just practice law wherever I want. So I have permission to act on two cases at this point. One is I guess the simplest way of putting it is it's a pure science-based argument. It's Nebraska, the Brunswick Anti-Shale Gas Alliance. They are one of the plaintiffs, and then there's some individuals who are part of Nebraska who are plaintiffs as well, just so that we have individuals and organization for legal purposes standing. And that lawsuit is premised on two things. One, that we're in the middle of climate change, and by that I mean we are in the middle of a situation in the alignment of what's going on the surface of the planet that could lead to the extinction of life on the surface. A serious threat to humanity, but more than just humanity, the four kingdoms: water, air, plant, and animal. And so this lawsuit says that climate change, which has that kind of consequence, violates the Canadian Constitution, in particular Section 7 of the Charter. Section 7 of the Charter says that we have the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, etc. And this lawsuit says, well, if you have the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, guaranteed, because that's what the Charter is, it guarantees these things. In fact, it requires government to promote the rights that are contained in it and the freedoms. And it overrides all laws and policies which might interfere with those. So, quite simply, do we need water in order to live? Do we need air in order to live? Do we need food in order to live? And do we need land? As human species, do we need those things? And if we do, if we lose one of them, then does that prejudice our right to life and security of the person? Now that legal argument is what is part of that particular lawsuit. And they're saying without, and the second thing is that in that context of a sort of legal position, which is what's in the statement of claim, these rights are not guaranteed to existing Canadians. If you look at the Charter, It doesn't say, we guarantee the right to life, liberty, and security of the person for those citizens who are living today. It's a forever guarantee. And if it's a forever guarantee that we have the right to life, which includes air, water, etc., then we don't have the right to do anything which is going to prejudice the right to life, liberty, and security of the person of future generations. It's a forever right, and therefore it's a forever responsibility. So you can't denigrate the water, you can't denigrate the air, you can't denigrate the land, which could cost not just life on the surface, but that clean air and water. Like if you go home, you live in Cape Breton, is it? Or?
Well, my heart's in Cape Breton, but my body's mostly in Halifax.
Okay. Yeah. If I can use the example of a rural family, you go home, you drink that nice clean water, you use the water to clean, to cook, to nurture your animals, livestock, your crop, your garden, your plants, your flowers, your pets. That's not a right that you own today only. It's a right that we have, your children and your grandchildren also have. 100 years from now, they have the same legal right. They have the right to drink that water and have it for those purposes. Same thing with the air. So that's an aspect of the legal challenge, which is that these are not temporary rights. If all the premiers in Canada get together and the federal government and unanimously agree to amend the Constitution and take it away, that they could do that. But that's not what it says right now. So that's a main aspect of it. The second aspect of it is directly dealing with fracking and shale gas and unconventional gas and oil development. UNGOD is the short acronym for that. Unconventional gas and oil development is ungodly. And so they, that lawsuit, amongst a number of its remedies, argues that unconventional oil and gas development, and particularly using fracking for hydraulic fracturing as a process scientifically, is going to harm the air, the water, and the land. Violates the right to life, liberty, and security of the person as well. And so they're seeking a moratorium.
So that's the main remedy, is just stop doing it for some period of time or forever?
Well, in their pleadings in front of the court, they sort of leave that open. It goes this way. Nothing is forever in terms of even the charter and rights and freedoms. We evolve as a society. So their lawsuit pleads that until you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the criminal standard of proof, because we're talking about life, with scientific certainty that what you're doing in your laws or policies won't contribute to climate change, you can't do it. So it's sort of like a moratorium until they meet that test.
Yeah, so this is the precautionary principle, and this is the essence of it, isn't it? Right?
Yes.
You don't do things unless you can be sure.
And when you're talking about human life and animals and the survival of the surface of the planet, humanity, the test should probably be as high as just about anything else. You know? So that's what that lawsuit does. And the second one does similar, but it goes broader. It alleges, well, in both of them, they allege it's a violation of international law to do these things, to engage in government activity through action or inaction, funding or not funding, taxation, policies, laws. like permitting, and licensing, and so on. You can't engage in any activity which is going to prejudice life, and that violates international law. The other lawsuit, which is, I think in the court, the document is sort of going to be referred to as Nolan et al., is a group of individuals who are Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people, most of whom are part of the traditional territory known as the Wabanaki Confederacy. And the lawsuit says that based on the fact that this land was never ceded, I mean, there's a peace and friendship treaty, but that was to work in harmony with each other. It didn't surrender any land or rights to the Crown. And because of that, you can't come into this territory and do things without our consent. And in particular, you can't do things like resource development and extraction processes, or even industries that are going to contribute to climate change. Because if one honors those original culture laws, that's not part of the law. You're supposed to live sustainably with each other, the land, the animals, the water, the air, in a way that's respectful. And fracking and shale gas and unconventional oil and gas, which contributes to a fossil fuel economy, which contributes to climate change, isn't that. So it's incompatible with original law, and it's not allowed to be done without the consent of the people. And that means their actual consent. And the other aspect is, which is supported by international law, they plead in their pleadings the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and a number of international covenants saying, look, when you're interpreting the Charter, like Section 7, you should be interpreting in a way that is consistent with international law at a minimum. The other aspect is protecting freedom of expression and freedom of religion in exercising your right to stop activities which are going to prejudice the air and the water and the land and your rights as Aboriginal people and as citizens. So those are added dimensions in that lawsuit, which are in addition to the first one.
As I listen to you describe this, I think if these cases are won, or if they're lost, but particularly if they're won, they change fundamentally a lot of things about the way we understand the law, the country, the relationships between the various peoples who are now living here. You know, these are really profound lawsuits.
Well, the pleadings can be viewed as that. I'm not, I wouldn't, probably not proper to use the word pessimistic, but one of the beautiful things about the legal process, the court process, and the Charter and international law in particular, is that it provides a place for a discourse. There's a famous, well, there's a writer, her name is Amartya Sen, and her book's called The Idea of Justice. And it's beautiful to approach the concept of law and the rule of law that way, and lawsuits like this and others give us a chance as citizens to have a discussion about what kind of society we want. The Charter guarantees these freedoms and rights. They can only be limited by Section 1, which at the end of it says that promote a free and democratic society. There's no definition of those words. There's no definition of them. And so I think that the world, I think the society in Canada, I think in New Brunswick, all across Canada and probably most of the world now, people want to have this discussion. Who knows what the discussion will lead to? The government is going to be there if we end up in court with its positions on those kinds of things, and citizens will have a chance to participate in the discussion about what kind of New Brunswick we're going to have, or what kind of Canada we're going to have. And that's starting to happen more and more in all kinds of forums and in the courts. And it's a way for us to not resolve differences, but to arrive at an understanding of where we want to go without violence. Canada's charter is unique in the history of the world. It is quite, in the sense that it gives the court system, which is not elected, sort of authority to say to government, which is elected, you can't do this because there's a higher purpose here, a higher moral, ethical concept of how we want to live that you've crossed here. And that's unique. And we're learning how to deal with that. It's you know, most judges, in fact, a lot of lawyers, I mean, we weren't brought up in a legal system where we could go to court and say to a government. I mean, can you imagine in 1981, one citizen saying, I don't like what the federal government and the Prime Minister are doing, I'm going to take you to court. And that the court has authority to order you to stop it. So I'm hopeful that this discourse is going to be valuable, and does it end up at the Supreme Court, and are people going to appeal it? We'll see. We have a chance. I mean, the Premier, and I want to say this, the Premier of New Brunswick, this government gave you a moratorium, and they identify 5 principles. Duty to consult, environmental harm, water, and so on, whether it's good for the citizens. But it also has a concept called social license. So I think that we should give this government as much nurturing as we can to make that successful. New Brunswick's, this is a beautiful, part of the reason why I'm here is because I love it. I mean, it's beautiful. My dad was in the military, so we were stationed all across the country, and this is one of the people here, because they're so close to the land. Wherever you live in New Brunswick, you're really close to the land, and that includes the water and the air and I think there's a friendliness. I mean, people use the term, well, people here are friendlier than they are elsewhere. I'm not going to say that because I don't want to insult people where I live. But you will hear people say, the closer you are to nature, the closer you are to each other. And that's true here. This is a beautiful, natural place. And it has a great potential for developing a way to nurture the beauty of New Brunswick. We've got the Bay of Fundy, tidal energy, solar, water. It could become a world leader, a Canadian leader here in those things. So I think there is a possibility that this discourse, which more and more people are engaged in, could lead to good things.
If I understand what you said from a more narrowly legal perspective, and you're the lawyer, I'm not, but I think what I hear you saying is that it may very well be that if these cases are one that the New Brunswick government might not choose to appeal, might just say, okay, that's consistent with who we are and who we want to be, and it's a statement of the relationships that are involved that we find quite congenial, and there's no need to pursue it any further.
Well, and there may not even be a need to pursue it all the way to a decision in the courts. You know, there's stages in the legal process. So
wouldn't you want to have it at some point on the record so that
as a precedent?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of the time that I won a little case about the possession of liquor, and it challenged the procedures that the police had been using to prosecute people for open liquor, and the judge did not render it. He found in my favor, but he did not give a decision because it was going to upset the whole way that was done, right? So you'd kind of want to get it on the record in some official way, wouldn't you?
Well, I take instructions. My role here is to do what I'm asked and give advice on the question of, I mean, if people here come to a resolution without having a court decision, that's a beautiful thing. It sets it's still a precedent, maybe not in the justice system, but it's still a precedent in the human system, and that's where things matter more. So I mean, I'll get instructions on it if we ever get to that stage, but I'm not in the area, in the way I practice, it's not really about the precedent on the record in the books. It's more about whether or not you accomplish what you want, the people you're acting for. And if they're happy, then they should be happy. And other jurisdictions can voluntarily do what you do here, or other people can file lawsuits too. I do know that across Canada and the United States, and generally now in the world, climate change lawsuits are becoming quite popular. So this discourse that's going to take place, and that has been taking place here, is happening all over. So
again, on another more narrowly legal matter, we've been doing a lot of work on the whole idea of environmental rights, both the human right to a healthy environment, but also Mother Nature's right to be protected and respected. And when you lay out the reasons for thinking that those rights are inherent in the right to life as guaranteed in the Charter, it seems to me just an irresistible train of logic. And I kind of wonder why. Well, there are other cases too that are trying to tease out essentially the same thing. Eco Justice's case in Sarnia with the Omjadong First Nation is a similar kind of thing. Has that ever actually been tested? Has anybody ever, are we now getting to the first time that anybody has said, okay, if you have the right, you've got to have the right to breathe and drink? And
like I said, the Charter is, I mean, some people, some academics in the courts have agreed to call it a living tree. So, I mean, it's only been planted. Its life is only, since 1982. You know, it's still in its early childhood in the concept of law. And so we're trying to define that. Formally, I'm not aware that there is a lawsuit like this. I think the New Brunswick ones might be the first that are actually asserting that is what the Charter and international law support formally. But I think that there are a growing number that are actually taking that. The other thing is that because it's an evolution, I mean, people need to appreciate what it's like to be a judge now in Canada. One day, through the proclamation of the Charter, you now have all this authority and responsibility. And we're trying to struggle with the words. I mean, it's a wide open book. What does the word freedom mean? Like, we as lawyers, as you know, we look at a statute, read a word, and then we try to figure out what it might mean. The word freedom doesn't, there's no dictionary, there's no regulation attached to the Charter saying here's what freedom means. Lawyers are no more qualified than you or any citizen to sort of give an opinion about what that word might mean. So Section 7, originally, we looked at it and we go, well, right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and it goes on, and right not to be denied, except in accordance with principles of fundamental justice. Well, that just deals with the legal system. So the development of that section of the Charter took place mostly around DWIs. You know, can you be arrested and denied? Because if you're arrested and you go to jail, then your freedom is gone. So that clearly covers liberty and security of the person. So the law went through all of that. And then as it went through that, some people did try. I mean, I was part of a group through the Court Challenges program that tried to argue that the right to life included social assistance. If you weren't able to provide for food, clothing, and shelter on your own, then the state had an obligation, because otherwise you wouldn't have any life, liberty, or security of the person. And of course we're reluctant to go there. But in the last 4 years, again, as we, as a society, as lawyers, and as judges, have people come forward and say, how about this? And so there's two big decisions. There's the Insight decision you might be familiar with from British Columbia, where they methadone. There was an attempt to shut down those clinics, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, the consequences to the people if we don't provide those clinics could prejudice their health and safety. And so Section 7 got to be viewed as something that would protect citizens outside the criminal justice system from serious harm that might threaten their life. And then there's the, I'll call it the Prostitution Case. Again, that went to the Supreme Court, and there was a discussion about criminalizing and putting, you know, mostly women in jail for, you know, being on the street. And there was an argument, it had been made several times, but finally was accepted by the Supreme Court of Canada, that the prejudice to the health of those women by criminalizing them didn't warrant that kind of treatment in the criminal justice system. So the court has sort of opened up the door to what does health mean? If you have the right to health under life, liberty, and security of the person, does that include other things? And so now we're going to have a discussion about, well, does it include water and air? And to what extent can we count on the state to protect water and air, which is part of health?
It's a fascinating development, and your view of the law is also quite fascinating, because you clearly do see it as an evolving living tree, but as an evolving process that changes and grows and adapts, and not as a, and I think a lot of people do see it as a very rigid thing. That's the law, man.
Oh yeah, one of my, I call him my mentor. He's a professor at the university where I took law. Says that human rights documents, like the Charter, like international law, covenants, declarations, American Constitution, right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, those are guidelines for society. They're not rules. How can you make a rule that, well, even rationally, you have the freedom of expression, sir? Well, what does that mean? Inherently, it's about human rights. And if you accept the theory of evolution, which I happen to, we need to evolve. And so I was watching some, you can go online and watch some of the techniques at Harvard Law School, for example. But in a lot of schools, law schools now, the discourse is what's important. Today we might not agree that this is what we want to do because we've never talked about it before in an honest way, like gay rights, for example. People have honest beliefs about that. Now, are they beliefs that we agree with? Some won't, some don't. So what we look at in the discussion is, well, I want to hear your honest view. What do these words mean? What kind of society do we want? And then it gets to, okay, can we at least agree that our differences shouldn't result in harm? Our differences as human beings shouldn't result in harm. We shouldn't, as a result of our beliefs, be allowed to kill, assault, hurt people because we have a difference of opinion. And when you get to that stage, then, okay, until, well, at this stage, how do we prevent that harm? Well, we need to protect those who are suffering it. And that leads to a discussion about, well, how do we protect those who are suffering it? Well, let's ban that behavior. So we have human rights. That's the basis of human rights. So you can't hurt somebody because they are Aboriginal, black, female, gay, disabled, etc. And as we grow, we may not need that anymore. And what we need to do in terms of remedies, solutions, I mean, in the judicial system we call them remedies, but when we get to the stage of, okay, well, what do we need now to stop the harm that's going on? It's going to change. And we want to keep room for that discussion. We don't want to say it means this forever. We want to say, for now, we are going to use this law to stop this harm in this way. We may not do it that way tomorrow.
It's a fascinating process when you look at it in this thoughtful way.
It's a beautiful, I mean, it's a privilege to be in the courtroom having that discussion. And what's even more important about it, and this came from a decision, again, around Section 7 and 10 and 11, which is around DWIs, on the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan in a leading case called Theron. It was a criminal justice case. And they were asked the question, and they asked themselves the question. Well, we got these words in this very short document called the Charter. I mean, if you're lawyers, we end up with some laws that are 100, 200, 300 pages long, and then a set of regulations. The Charter is, essentially 15 sections for most people. And they said, well, since this is written for the people, shouldn't we give it a meaning that the people think it has? Well, who figures that out? The people do. You can go to court on your own. You don't need a lawyer if you're defending yourself on the Charter. Or you can have a lawyer go to court and argue your words for you. But it gives, that's the view of most of the living tree doctrine. It's like, so it's not it's nothing to do with what I think. I just got to be part of the process of that evolution. I graduated from law school just as the Section 15 of the Charter was being proclaimed.
You feel quite strongly that something very beautiful has happened in New Brunswick over the events with which you now find yourself engaged. Tell me about that.
I would sort of say there's three parts to it. From what, I mean, because I'm not from here, but from what I've learned and heard people say and watched. One is there seemed to be a fear about questioning government and holding it accountable. There has been some victories and the DNB power stuff, but it's sort of general can we really do anything about this using the law? And secondly, around fracking and environment, in New Brunswick, it's happening elsewhere, but what is beautiful here is people now, through the work of the Nebraska and those people associated with it, people in New Brunswick are now having a discussion. They're participating in a discussion about how they want life to be here. There's nothing more beautiful than when somebody says, I want to have a voice. I mean, I see you nodding your head because you know what I'm talking about. When someone says, I want to have a say about my life, that's a beautiful moment to be part of and to be present to hear. Because that's the beginning of nothing but beautiful things can come from that discussion. If everybody feels safe and entitled to have a voice on a topic. In New Brunswick, citizens ended up having that in an incredible way in an election. It became a topic in an election against a government that was very strong. I will avoid using words that other than that, but it was a very strong government. It had a lot of authority and support from powerful structures in the Brunswick society. And this topic about, I want to have a say about my environment. I want to have a say about the quality of life I get to live in my country, in my province, became the topic of the election. The moratorium against fracking became a symbol of that sort of notion. Do I have a right to what kind of water, what kind of quality of life me and my future generations are going to live? And they defeated a very strong government that way. Well, I mean, that's a beautiful moment. And that government has listened. I mean, they declared a moratorium. I mean, no, the corporations, the oil and gas industry, they're not insignificant in Canada or in New Brunswick in terms of their ability to influence everyone. Shale gas, in particular, has something that everyone's looking at as the next big fossil fuel energy source. And the Brunswick citizens and the Premier listened and the government listened and declared a moratorium on that. And now the consequence of that is they want more discourse. So it appears that this government is taking the lead in involving its citizens in a real discussion, an honest discussion about the impact of unconventional oil and gas, fracking, shale, maybe in the context of climate change. I mean, the option in the discussion from the government includes looking at sustainable energy. Well, and involving citizens in that. Like, who wouldn't want to be part of a society that's doing that? You know, so this is quite a powerful moment, and it could provide leadership and direction to, I personally think, almost everyone else who wants some guidance about how do we get out of the mess we're in when it comes to the environment, and how do we stop doing the harm. I use the word genocide, and intentionally so. How do we end the genocide of the original people in this territory? How do we end that? It's got to stop. And the convergence of that is climate change. Well, sun, if you look at all original cultures, sun is honored. Water is fundamental. It's in some cultures goddess. In all original cultures, water is sacred. Well, guess what? We now know the reason for that. Because the alternative to fossil fuel is what? The sun, solar, water, hydro, or tidal, or ocean, air, wind energy. It's been there. It's there for us, and New Brunswick's in a position to have a discussion about that too. So that's why what's happened here is beautiful. The engagement that's taking place on having that kind of relationship. And it has an inevitability about it. You hear people, I mean, most of my original culture lives from the land in the Ukraine and then here. Farmers, rural people know this. I mean, we all do. When you live in harmony with the land, you have a tendency to live in harmony with each other. It just flows. So there's the discussion that's happening here in New Brunswick where people who never used to talk to each other are now talking to each other.
You have a quote that that is a very powerful one about the importance of getting things right between the Indigenous and people and the settlers in this country and the future of the planet. Tell me about that.
When I began sort of looking at all this, and I can tell you the reason, I think it's important to hear why I started this area of law. My son, who's 21, came home one day, or came over, he's living out, and said voluntarily, sort of while we were watching a show, he's not going to have children. And I kind of freaked at that. I'm a kind of overprotective dad. And I'm going, well, what do I not know? What's going on? Why are you telling me this? That was all in my head. I just kept it there. And then sort of at a commercial break, I said, well, what do you mean? Why'd you say that? He says, climate change. I understand that I'm probably not going to be alive for more than 20 to 25 years. Why would I want to have children? And that shocked me, because he's not your radical, he's a typical, still call him teen, he went party, he worked, he goes to school. And then I started hearing it more and more from a lot of other parents and young people, that there's this sort of belief that we don't have much time left to live. I don't know if you were alive in the 60s, but I mean, the threat of nuclear war, we were worried about that. But that was a worry. There seems to be a growing acceptance that it's just a fact. I don't know how you can live like that. I don't want anyone I love to be living like that. And so that led to me getting involved. And then I started listening to people talk about the original ways, you know, the natural laws, the way we used to be, our original culture, our original laws. We used to have our own system. So I started listening to what that was and paying attention to what everyone was saying about that as much as I could using social media and research. And it became clear that Canada is where a substantive portion, if not a majority of the portion of the remaining scarce fossil fuels exist, like the tar sands, the oil sands. And so if there's going to be any expansion, people got to come here. Companies and corporations and countries need to get that out of the ground here, like China. And turns out that most of that, if not all of it, is on land, which is where Aboriginal people live. So eventually I saw a quote. It was on Facebook. Yes, it's on Facebook. I'm on Facebook. I read it. It's called The Guardian in the United Kingdom. And it was fascinating because it's important to remember that's not a Canadian publication. And the quote goes something like this: the rights or the human rights of Indigenous people in Canada and our support for them will determine the fate of the planet. And when I first read that, I was going, it has to have some meaning that I don't get. And if they can see it all the way from the United Kingdom in Britain, then there must be something to it. And it is. They see that unless we stop the genocide, and genocide means the end of a culture, the end of a way of life, and everything that went with it. The customs, the beliefs, the rules, the laws, if you want to call it, all of that. Genocide destroys that. It removes it from existence. Well, if we want to stop climate change, and we got to shift away from the fossil fuel economy and move towards sustainable, we need to do two things. We need to remove that culture, those people, from having any self-governance, any basis for their living their own way of life in order to get to that fossil fuel. And secondly, the original cultures lived in harmony with the earth, with the animals, with the water, with the air, and the land, in a way that preserved their societies for tens of thousands of years. Fossil fuel economy has only been in existence for what, a little over 100 years. And in that short period of time, in a little over 100 years, in the time that we've been on the surface of the planet, which is hundreds of thousands of years, we brought it to the brink. Whether you think it's man-made or not, we are threatening the whole existence of life. So if we destroy that culture, then we'll never know those ways. We won't learn them. And so that's why that quote seems to say to people, we need to pay attention to what's going on here with original culture, Aboriginal people. Why is the government, why is everyone looking at taking away their rights? There's more to it. And at this moment in time, in New Brunswick, which is another aspect of what's beautiful here, is that there's that discussion. People who are farmers or settlers or non-Aboriginal or whatever term you want to use, and who are Aboriginal or original culture, are sitting down and talking to each other and hearing each other's stories and learning about the solutions to the problem that we are all facing. And that's to learn, understand, and respect and honor the way of living that survived all these centuries, you know?
It's, to me, that's one of the most striking things about this whole anti-fracking movement and the whole, I mean, it's two or three things that really strike me. One of them is the courage, that ordinary people are willing to go out there day after day, you know, say thou shalt not pass, right? And get arrested and go to jail and, you know, have, you know, broken limbs and things like that coming out of that. And nevertheless, they just don't stop, you know. So the courage of those people strikes me as being really a profound inspiration. And the second thing is the coalition, is the reaching out to each other and the finding each other over all the divides that have been holding us apart, and finding that we can do these things together. To me, those are perhaps even more important than the fracking itself, you know.
I would agree with you and even go further. It's fundamentally what's necessary. And it is happening. And that's powerful. I mean, when we start breaking the walls down between us as humans that have been created for all kinds of reasons, genocide, racism, sexism, homophobia, when we start realizing at the end of the day we're actually all human, we all love the same things, we all feel sadness and joy and happiness and despair, and we all want not to feel that way, and we want to live in a way where we accept that we're all different. We don't want to eliminate the differences between us. We just don't want to have those differences be the basis upon which we hurt each other. And when people start talking and acting like that, well...
And maybe even the next step is we don't want to eliminate those differences because we recognize them as a form of wealth. We recognize them as providing us with a series of choices that are all available to all of us, provided they still exist and are honored.
Yes. Yeah.
Tell me about CSIS.
Bill C-51 was brought forward. And if you follow social media and even the mainstream media, people were really scared about the fact that it was going to expand the powers of CSIS, and it would have the effect of making protesters and people who just disagree with government policy potentially arrested without warrant, monitored as if they are terrorists, or I hate that term. You either are a person who kills people without reason and therefore a criminal, or you're not. But there is a lot of fear going on in this country. A lot of opposition, but this sort of, oh my God, if you take the people in New Brunswick like you were talking about, if I stand up, I can be arrested, and even more than I was before. The possibility of me being punished for having a voice is going to be dramatically increased. And people saw that. I mean, you could read people, and in fact there's, you know, suggestions in media stories and stuff that there's proof in articles that they were going to target environmentalists and Aboriginal activists. And that was the purpose of C-51. And so CSIS having all of that power, watching your every move, and being able to share the information they gathered on you with every other government agency, was building an awful lot of fear of people in terms of jobs, employment possibilities, grants, you name it. If I'm on the wrong side and I get flagged, it's going to cost me. So I was at a gathering in Saskatoon of Aboriginal activists, Aboriginal people, mostly women, some elders, some grandmothers, and some environmentalists, and some farmers. And they were learning about what was happening with each other and telling their stories. And then it became a time to talk about, well, what are we going to do about this? And out of one workshop, there was a discussion, well, we need to be united. We need to tell them, we need to send a message to the government and everybody that we, Indigenous people and settlers, are united. You're not going to divide us. It's going to have the opposite effect. So somebody said, well, why don't we just form CSIS? And so it's Canadian, settler, and Indigenous solidarity is the name they came up with. And immediately, I mean, I felt myself going, oh my, that's so beautiful. It's so correct, which is such a horrible term, but it's just so right that in the face of what appears to be a law which is to promote fear and keep us from talking to each other, like we were talking about before, to we're going to talk to each other even more than we used to. In fact, we're going to build solidarity with each other like we've never done before. Flips everything. It removes the fear. It can be fun. We can have a lot of fun, you know. I won't sort of go into all those ideas because everybody can play with them themselves. I mean, you were coming with ideas too, but I mean, for example, I mean, do we want to have CSIS training in Canada? Do we want to have CSIS training in the schools? Yeah, let's have Indigenous and settler solidarity training. Let's learn how to talk to each other. Let's learn how to support each other. So that was just a cute, beautiful.
But it wonderfully muddies the water too. I mean, you know, for example, if somebody comes up to you now and says, "I'm a member of CSIS," you say, if somebody comes up to you now and says, "I'm a member of CSIS," you say, "Great," right? It's you know, what does that phrase mean? Now all of a sudden you've turned it upside down, or you've confused it so that, you know, you've taken a lot of the sting out of it.
That, and as well, it's sort of like, I'm a fan of the concept of dialectics. It's a political theory. It's becoming a sort of established. I mean, it's like some people don't like dark, some people don't like light, but this concept says, you know, you have to have dark, otherwise you'll never know what light is. We need that kind of relationship, and CSIS, this 4 words that form that acronym. Turn the light on to the darkness that people perceive CSIS to be. And it's kind of cool. There's nothing that's new about this concept. If you look at how we have evolved on the surface of this planet as people, as humans, every time we stop being scared of each other and learn to talk to each other and respect each other, we move forward and incredible things have happened.
Larry Kowalchuk, the remarkable human rights and environmental lawyer who is representing two groups of New Brunswick citizens in fundamental legal challenges to the fossil fuel industry and the governments that support them. If you enjoyed this interview, you'll probably enjoy our conversations with Aboriginal legal philosopher John Borrows or the brilliant Filipino attorney Antonio Oposa Jr. For all three of these legal thinkers, the law is as much a creative instrument as a brush is to a painter or a keyboard to a pianist. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for joining me.